Today we want to turn to John chapter 6. At the beginning of the chapter, we see the Lord Jesus feeding 5,000 men just with 5 bread and 2 fish. That was a miracle. It was a deed that showed that he was the Son of God, because nobody else could do something like that. He showed all his power to the people and the disciples. And even the people wanted to make him king, as it says in verse 15. It says, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, what did he do there? You see, he accepted it. Finally, he got his right to be king over Israel. No, he did not. He departed again to the mountain to be by himself alone. That was his purpose. He went to the mountain. That was his usual place where he went to pray. There was a place, a desert place, where nothing would distract him from the fellowship with his Father. And therefore, he chose that place, to be on the mountain with his Father in that wonderful fellowship. And the disciples, what did they do? When we read and continue in verse 16, we see that they went to the shore and took a boat to go to Capernaum in verse 17. And it says it was already dark and Jesus had not come to them yet. And the disciples, what did they do? Of course, they started going to Capernaum. They took the boat and they started going over the sea. So far, nothing wrong. Everything was fine. They were on the way the Lord wanted them to be, to go to Capernaum. But now, all over the sudden, we read that the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So all of a sudden, the disciples were in a distress. Did they have a reason to be fearful or anxious in this situation? Certainly not. Had not the Lord stayed back on the mountain to pray? Would he not also pray for the disciples, knowing they were in difficult circumstances? Certainly. But let us not condemn the disciples. The disciples were somehow like we. When we reflect on our own, we find ourselves almost in the same situation. The disciples were in the middle of the sea. In verse 19 it says they were about 3-4 miles already in the sea. They were, so to speak, alone. There was nobody who could help them. And we read it was dark. Darkness around them, alone. Is that not also a situation that we have to face today? We are alone in the world. It is dark around us. Perhaps darker today than ever before. The wind rises against us and the sea is hostile. The world hates us and opposes us. If not, it inevitably means that we have become like the world. If we stand with the Lord Jesus and represent his rights, we will face rejection. Is this a reason to be anxious or fearful? No. The Lord Jesus is on the mountain. Today, he is in heaven and praying for us. Just as he remembered his disciples in prayer in these difficult circumstances, he is praying for us today. Let us hold on in all difficulties to this wonderful truth that he is now in heaven interceding for us. He thinks of us and sees us in our circumstances. The disciples were alone on the sea. Alone, yeah, somehow, but not really alone. When they were already in the middle of the sea, towards morning, as we read in the 4th watch of the night, as it says in Matthew, the Lord Jesus came. It says here in verse 19, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. The Lord Jesus came walking on the sea. in their circumstances. They were not forgotten. The Lord was present in these circumstances, even if not directly with them. But now he came directly to them to strengthen them. But how did the disciples react? They were frightened. They were so occupied with the circumstances that they did not recognize the Lord. Yes, they thought even it was a ghost, as it says in Matthew chapter 14, verse 26. Don't we often behave similarly? Instead of turning our gaze away from our circumstances and looking to Him, we are so occupied with the wind and the waves, the things around us, that we do not recognize the Lord Jesus when He comes to us. Always remember, He is present in the circumstances, even if we do not recognize Him directly. He is ready to help, and He already knows that the way out when we no longer see a way out. What can a person do to us when He is for us? What can any circumstance do to us when He is for us? And what does the Lord Jesus do? Of course, the Lord addresses His disciples. He calls to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." What a wonderful word. It is I. No one else but the one who revealed Himself as the Messiah to the woman of Samaria at the well in chapter 4. The one who demonstrated His power the day before by healing and feeding the people, now comes to His disciples and calls them not to be afraid. Had they already forgotten the miracles of the previous day? It seems so. Isn't it often the same with us? We have just experienced the power of the Lord, and then when the wind is against us, we have already forgotten everything. But His, "It is I, do not be afraid," applies to us too. He is the helper in our circumstances. He stands by us. We just have to trust Him and to look at Him, to look away from everything else, but to look at Him. And the disciples, what is their reaction? We read in verse 21 at the beginning, they were willing to receive Him in the boat. You see, the Lord Jesus approaches, and the disciple were willing to receive Him. In the same way, we need to be willing to receive Him. The Lord Jesus does not force Himself on us. He is present in our circumstances and sees us in our situation. But we must want to take Him. If we don't want to, He cannot come into the circumstances. Then we lose a great blessing. Let's do it like the disciples. Consciously take Him into the ship, taking Him into our circumstances. Then we will experience what the disciple experienced. And immediately the ship was on the land to which they were going. What a wonderful result of His word. The gaze of the disciples was turned away from the circumstances and focused entirely on the Lord Jesus. Under the guidance of the Spirit of God, John does not report, as Matthew does, that the wind ceased. That was completely unimportant at that moment. The Lord Jesus was now in the boat. That alone was important. He was now the focal point, the only one the disciples were looking at. That's why John mentions nothing about the future journey. This time is skipped, as if it did not exist. Immediately, the ship was at the land to which they were going. What a wonderful experience is this. Remember in all circumstances and situations that He is with us. He never abandons us. He sees the way out even when we do not see it